Hello, everyone. My name is Magdi Hanna, and I will be your speaker for this webinar today on scenario-based development and testing, doing it right the first time. This webinar is hosted by the International Institute for Software Testing and Ramana Software. We thank you for setting aside a time to be with us today during this webinar, and we hope that you will join us in other webinars. This webinar also is hosted by the International Conference on Practical Software Quality and Testing, to be held in San Diego, August 14th through the 19th, 2016. To get more information about the webinar, about the conference and the program for the conference, please go to psqtconference.com. And there's also a link to the conference site from the IIST website, testinginstitute.com. Let me start this webinar by presenting to you what you might already know about what are the important characteristics of requirements. How would we know that a requirement is good? Right? You might have seen some of those characteristics before. You might have read some of them. The IEEE has a list of about 9 items. In my opinion, in order for a requirement to be testable or verifiable, as I stated here in number 6, it has to be all those 5 things above. A requirement must be understandable, meaning that when you read it, you can understand it with no question asked. And some requirements are, some requirements are not. Most importantly, a requirement must be correct, meaning that it should state exactly what the customer said, nothing else. Of course, if a requirement is incorrect, it is because the person who wrote the requirement, whether he or she is a business analyst, a product owner, or whoever wrote it, has not done a very good job in actually describing what the customer wanted. A requirement also must be complete, meaning that it should include all the details that are required for developers to write the design and write the code, and the details required for the tester to write the test cases. All right. A requirement also must be consistent, meaning that there is no contradiction either between parts of the same requirement or between a requirement and another requirement. When there is a contradiction between parts of the same requirement, we call it internal inconsistency, and if the contradiction between the requirement and another requirement, we call it external inconsistency. Now, above all that, a requirement must be unambiguous, and ambiguity has to do with the multiple interpretation. When 5 or 10 people read a requirement, they must have the same interpretation for that requirement. Of course, interestingly enough to know that ambiguity comes to requirements either from inconsistency, because if the requirement is inconsistent, meaning that there is internal or external contradiction, then immediately the requirement becomes ambiguous. It becomes ambiguous because of the fact that 2 different people or 5 different people are going to look at the different sides of the contradiction. Also, interestingly enough, that if the requirement is not complete, it will be ambiguous as well. Because when a requirement is incomplete, meaning that it is missing details, so leaving out details is actually leaves some room for people to make assumptions. And when different people read an incomplete requirement and make assumptions about the missing details, immediately the requirement becomes ambiguous. All right. Of course, if the requirement is not understandable, meaning that you can understand it, but I cannot understand it, the requirement becomes ambiguous again. So ambiguity really is a major problem with requirements. only, and that's my opinion, I'm sure many of you would agree with me on that, only if a requirement is all those five. If it is understandable, correct, complete, consistent, and unambiguous, only then it becomes testable or verifiable or implementable, if I should say, if I'm talking to developers. Well, if you're willing to believe my experience, I have not seen one single requirement in my life, including those requirements that I write myself. I have not seen one single requirement that meets all those five characteristics. So every day we deal with requirements that are not testable. These are few things we know about requirements. They're always incomplete, they're always ambiguous. And most of the details come up during the development process. Developers always say, forgive me, developers will always say, let's get started, and I'm sure we're going to have more questions as we go. This problem exists even in Agile projects more than non-Agile projects. Perhaps in non-Agile traditional waterfall model, people are willing to spend more and more time with the requirement to, as we say, nail it down. This does not happen in Agile projects. Why? Because we don't have much time. So in Agile projects, we start possibly with a high-level user story, and as we all know, those user stories do not have much details. Of course, don't get me wrong, because in good Agile projects, we take the time, we ask lots of questions about the user story. We possibly can elaborate on the user story using what we call verification criteria or implementation criteria or whatever more details you want to provide. But the truth that remains is that in Agile projects, we have much less complete, much more ambiguous requirements or user stories than what we would have with non-Agile traditional projects. Everyone agrees with that. No one can tell me that we do a far better job with requirements in our Agile projects than non-Agile. Also, we all know that many adjustments to those requirements happen during development. Meaning what? Meaning that we started talking to the business analyst or to the customer or whoever wrote the requirement, or in an Agile project, we talk more to the product owner, so we make some adjustments, or developers make adjustments. When they make adjustments, those are minor changes, not necessarily major changes, because in a project where we have we possibly could have a very robust change management process, people will say, no, if the requirement will change, then possibly we will have the customer to submit a change request, and the change request gets approved and all that stuff. Well, guess what? That does not happen anymore, not in non-Agile projects or even in Agile projects. So when requirements are adjusted during the development time, so the original requirement has changed. The original requirement as the test team has understood it. As a result, it has been my experience for the last 35 years that when we come to test, especially if the test team is separate from the development team, I say this because there are some organizations, including the one I'm going to next week, I got a surprise that developers are doing all the testing. And actually, I was meeting with another organization 2 weeks ago, and they said the same thing. They said they did not have a dedicated test team that tests requirements. The developers do all the testing. And in Agile projects, a lot of testing happens by requirements as well, by developers as well. So as a result, when we have a test team that is looking at the requirement or the user story or whatever they're looking at to try to test, what I have seen in many projects that the code coverage is very low. Again, that was my experience back in one of the projects in the mid 90s when a large project, multi-years, multi-million-dollar project has been canceled because the code coverage was very low. And why was it low? Because the development team worked closely with the customer and with the requirement engineers, and the requirements have evolved and evolved over time. And the test team was left out of the loop. So when we try to test based on requirements, we find out that we are not testing everything in the code. We may be testing everything in the requirement as, to the best of our knowledge. But if we were to think about how much of the code have we actually tested, probably no more than 50, 60%. So for so many years, I've been thinking about ways to improve this. So typically we take a requirement, we start using it to write our tested design. Of course, many of you would say, well, we don't do this exactly because we do user stories, we do implementation criteria or verification criteria, and that's what we use for tested design. But the majority of us relies heavily on requirements to build our design. The same is true with developers. I think you would agree. Developers take requirements or take user stories and write the code or the design. This is a very, very common practice. If you think back at your projects, and please, if your organization does something different, please share this with me through the questions panel. Just to click on questions and tell me how your organization is doing this differently, and I will share it with the rest of the audience. This has been a common practice all the time. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to stop doing that. We're going to stop taking requirements and designing tests based on that. And we're going also to stop taking requirements and writing design or code. I meant to put this chart in front of you so that it remains in your mind even after you leave that presentation and go back to your projects. I am seeing it clearly. This is a very poor practice. How do I know that? I know that based on experience of over 35 years working with projects, seeing projects failing every day and looking back at why they failed is because of this, because we take requirements written by someone and those requirements are not complete, they're ambiguous, they're inconsistent, and we did not even know that. So when the customer comes back and say, how come it does not do this? How come the application or the system does not do this? Or how come it does it this way? It's supposed to do it that way. Well, guess what? What happened here is we had a bad requirement to start with. And we all know that when a problem like this happens in systems, it costs us so much to fix. This is not a coding problem. This is not a design problem. This is a requirement problem. And if you read the literature, different people suggest different numbers, but the only thing I'm going to tell you, it would cost much thousands of times more to fix a problem like that than to test a problem that's a result of simply writing the bad code. All right. So with that being said, I am suggesting, and I have been suggesting this to companies over the last probably 15 years now. I've been teaching this for years, and I keep doing this as a free webinar. I teach it in my courses. This is what we base all our development and testing on at the International Institute for Software Testing. And you can imagine this is the same methodology that many companies have followed. I have customers who have told me that they were able to reduce the number of open tickets by more than 70%. Now, let me explain the process first. You probably have seen this if you've taken my courses on best practices and test planning and the design, or my courses on Agile requirements or Agile tested design. You probably have seen a similar chart before. Just out of curiosity, if I can see a raise of hand, how many of you have actually seen this methodology from me before? If you have seen it, it should be from me. I don't think anyone else out there have this methodology. All right, I don't see any show of hands, meaning that no one has seen it before. All right. And I'm assuming that everyone is hearing me because I'm not hearing otherwise. So if you're not hearing me for any reason, you're not going to hear me. But if you are hearing me, please just confirm that by raising your hand. Just the fact that I did not. Okay, thank you so much. That's because of the fact that I did not get any hands up when I asked the question. I got a doubt that no one is hearing me. All right, looking at the questions panel here to see if we have any anyone sharing with us that they're doing something different. All right. All right, thanks. No one is sharing anything. A few people are making comments. Okay. So we start with a requirement that's been defined by someone. We analyze that requirement carefully. We ask as many questions as we can. My process here suggests that we should always record the answers to the questions. So we should record the answers being asked. We should record the answers to those questions. Okay. The reason is over time, we tended to forget what questions were asked and what answers were given. In fact, those questions and the answers to those questions are supposed to be an integral part of the requirement. Meaning that when developers start writing the code and the design for the requirement, and when testers started designing their tests, they should not only be looking at the requirement, but they should also be looking at what kind of questions were asked during this process and what answers were provided. That's why I always suggest that when we do those requirement review sessions, if we do them, then they really must be done online. Meaning what? Meaning we don't have to sit down in a room and meet and talk about the requirement. We post the requirement somehow on some sort of a tool or work group support tool, whether it is SharePoints or anything else. I do this all the time in Ramana, and people will ask the questions through the tool, and whoever is supposed to provide the answers should provide those answers through the tool. So it becomes historical data. Anyone can go to it anytime. In Ramana ALM, which is a tool that we have architected to implement all these processes. In fact, you can, when you generate what we call the requirement details report with all the requirements or all the user stories, you have one checkbox to check to say, I want to also include all the questions that were asked and all the answers that were given to those questions. All right. Once you analyze the requirement and you ask as many questions as you can and they get some answers, now you start building your scenarios. In this chart, as you can see, there are 3 ways by which you can build the scenarios. You can build the scenarios informally by brainstorming from the requirement. Simply look at the requirement and say, what are some of the scenarios? Let me define quick what scenarios are. A scenario is a very simple thing. Please do not think of a scenario as a sequence of steps. I keep looking at scenarios that people write, and they write sequence of steps. A scenario is not a sequence of steps. A scenario is a simple statement, a simple phrase that describes an action. No, I'm sorry, that describes a condition or a situation that could possibly happen in production. If you do not use this definition for a scenario, then you cannot follow this process because it's going to be very difficult to follow. If you start thinking of a scenario as a sequence of actions or sequence of steps, then that process is difficult to follow, because you're not going to be easily sitting down brainstorming a sequence of steps. I want you to brainstorm simply one phrase at a time that describes a situation or a condition. I'll show you some examples in a minute here. All right, the steps or the actions that you might be thinking of are actually the steps or the actions that would be used to achieve that scenario. But when we think about scenario, we do not want to think about steps or actions yet. I know when we speak about scenarios in the context of use cases, we think of them as steps. I am not thinking scenarios in the context of use cases here. I'm thinking about scenarios as a very conceptual thing. It's a concept that says it's a scenario that happened. Something happened. Someone was trying to place an order and they got disconnected. Someone is trying to register for a course at the IICT site and found that the course is not available. Very simple. That's what scenario is. If we stick with that definition of a scenario, trust me, we will do far better. So we do not want to drill down right away. Okay, so you could build the scenarios either by brainstorming directly, and there is a process to it. You can build the scenarios through use cases, in which case the scenario will be much more complete and much more detailed, and it will have those steps we're talking about. In fact, my methodology for use cases, and I'm getting ready to go and teach a 3-day course on use cases at one of the companies. My methodology for use cases is to do this brainstorming first. When you do brainstorming and they come up with, for a given requirement, you come up with 60 or 70 scenarios, then you can go here and start writing more and more details for each one of those scenarios. There is no way that we can use the use case methodology and come up with all the scenarios at once. Why? Because again, each scenario in use case can take easily 15-20 minutes to write. I want you to write scenarios here that takes only less than a minute. In my classes, I give people one exercise and I give them 5 minutes. I give them a requirement, I give them 5 minutes, and I say, I want to see how many scenarios you can write in 5 minutes, just to give you an idea. And typically some people write 5 scenarios in 5 minutes. But the majority of people write 10 to 15 scenarios in 5 minutes. That's really the goal. The goal is to write as many scenarios as possible, because the more scenarios you can write, the more details you have about the requirements, the more design and more code developers are going to write, and the more testing your testing team is going to do. And as a result, the more reliable and more predictable your system is going to be. All right. We can also build the scenario through models. And again, models are different thing. Some of you might know about them. And it's a part of my requirement course and part of my use case courses. Models are things like decision tables, decision trees, state models, data models. There are so many models. And those models, I found out over the years, they can give you a reasonable way by which you can have scenarios. The bottom line is you are going to have for each requirement or each user story. And by the way, I am not differentiating here between requirements and user stories. When I say requirements in the context of this webinar, I mean either a requirement or a user story. In fact, I might have a chance to show this to you later on in the webinar, if I have a chance to show you how Ramana ALM does that. Okay. So once you have a set of scenarios, and I'm talking about for a requirement or for a user story, you could easily have anywhere from 40 to 50, 60 different scenarios. Those scenarios need to be validated. And I'll explain to you in a little bit what I mean, or what the scenario validation process is. Once the scenarios have been validated and finalized, then those scenarios are given to the development team to write their design and write their code. Those scenarios are given to the test team to write their test cases. So that's why we call it scenario-based development and testing, right? Now, once the code is complete and the build is complete and the test cases are complete, we go now and start running the tests from a testing perspective. Here are two things you'll find happening right away. One, you'll find that code coverage problem that we've been living with for so many years, that have been the cause of the failure of many projects. That problem is resolved completely. I've seen code coverage more in the upper 90%. And someone says, why is that? How did we achieve that kind of code coverage? Because developers and testers are working from the same page, which is the validated scenarios. In fact, the details of the process suggests that if a developer, while he or she is writing code or doing design, if they think about something that was not here in the scenarios, they should post it as a scenario such that the test team can see it. We're talking about here a tool that everyone can see. And we're not talking about the developer is opening a Word document to create the scenarios or to add additional scenarios. No, because then we will have a tedious process of how we're going to share this document with the test team. It is as simple as this. When you use a tool like Ramana ALM, I don't know what other tools out there that can support this idea or this practice. A developer will simply click on the scenario box and add one more scenario. The test team will receive an immediate message that says, Joe has just added one more scenario for the requirement number, whatever. That's it. So that's why, although this process, as you see it, looks like sequential, and some of you might get the wrong idea that this is good only for traditional waterfall model, non-agile projects. This is totally wrong, because this is actually the best process to follow in an agile project, because everything happens on the fly. A developer sits down, writes code, and he discovers 2 or 3 things that are not mentioned in the scenarios. He starts clicking on buttons in the tool and add the scenario. The tester gets a message that the developer has added the scenario. We're kind of going back to the scenario validation process. So we're going this iteratively. All right, sure, we had the requirement, we analyzed the requirement, we asked questions, we came up with scenarios, we validated scenarios. But we should be willing to add scenarios either by developers or by testers anytime. And that's the way it should be. And if the developer adds a scenario, because he or she found out that it's supposed to be supported, then the tester needs to grab that scenario and write test cases for it. If a tester finds that the set of scenarios that were written here and were validated are incomplete and we need to add more scenarios, they can go and add more scenarios here. And those scenarios get validated, and the developer now need to know and write code for that. That's really what it is. Because of that, code coverage becomes much better. We get a much higher level of code coverage. The other thing you're going to see happening, as has been reported by many companies, is that the number of problems, number of open tickets, if you call them, number of issues, number of bug reports generated by the test team is much less. Why? Because we've been working together. Developers and testers are working together. Isn't it what all agile projects suggest? That we don't have development team and test team anymore, but we have one agile team? Why do I have to have an agile project? This is a great practice, by the way. To have one agile team, it's a great practice. Now you can adopt to this practice even if your project is not agile. I've been wondering for so many years, and the years before, remember, the Agile Manifesto came out about what, 14 years ago. Years before that, when I worked on that project that failed in the early 90s, I kept asking the question, says, why were developers and testers working in isolation? And of course, I got the interesting answer that says, because the government, which was a customer for that project, strongly believes in what's called independent verification and validation. I said, independent does not mean that they work independently. It means that they're not reporting to the same vice president or the same director of the development team. Okay? Independent means that they have their own independence in making the decision, but it doesn't mean that they're not one team. So keep that in mind, please. Whether your project is agile or not, your development team, your testing team is one team. If you start separating them, then you're not going to have good results. So I found, as I said, I've got customers who said they were able to reduce the number of open tickets by more than 70%. Thank you, Tracy. Just looking at the questions here to see if there's any question that I need to answer. All right. And let me also thank Fred for the few comments he made about the slides. Thank you, Fred. All right. So really, in a project, if you look at this chart, this is a very interesting process. I built this process so that we don't see much difference between an agile and non-agile project. This is simply says you're going to use this project in any, you're going to use this methodology in any project, whether it's agile or not. In this chart, if you look at, and this is really a little bit of revised chart from the one I use in my courses in designing and executing tests for agile projects. Interestingly enough, when I go on to speak to people about agile, of course you can imagine, you got to ask the question in the beginning. It says, how many of you are actually working in an agile project? And some people will be able to say, yes, we are using agile methodologies. And almost in every session I have, especially if that session is a live session in person, I see people looking at each other like, say, are we really doing agile or not? Last time I was speaking, I can't remember, about what, 3 weeks ago? Can't remember even where. So I asked the question and I said, how many of you would say, yes, our project, we are using agile methodologies? And two ladies looked at each other, looked at me, says, we don't know. We're using something we don't know if it is agile or not, or we don't know if it is the right agile or not. But anyway, that's why really the separation between agile and non-agile should go away, because it's a gray area anyway. When you look at Ramana ALM, you'll see that it deals with agile and non-agile projects very much the same way. So all what we know actually in agile projects, things are less formal than in a non-agile project. That's all what I'm going to tell you. In an agile project, things go faster than in an agile project. You know that. In agile projects, things go much more iterative than in non-agile projects. So faster, more iterative, and less formal. And there might be a few other things. But so when you see two different shades of colors on this chart, the darker shades represent more formal practice. If you are really running an agile project, you're probably using user stories or user interface models. When I say user interface models, I'm talking about screen prototypes. Now, does this mean that we cannot use screen prototypes in a non-agile project? We do. So you can do any combinations of the above. I've seen some agile projects doing requirements and user stories. I've seen other agile projects using use cases. All right. So it doesn't matter. So what we're talking about here at the top layer is different forms of the requirements. As you can see, whatever the form is, you need to get to that process where you ask questions and document the answers. You build the scenarios, you validate scenarios. This is just another diagram that shows you that you start with whatever you have. It doesn't matter if it is user story or a requirement or a model or anything else. So we already defined what a scenario is. It's any situation or any condition that could possibly happen. And of course, scenarios can be normal or abnormal. I call them positive and negative. Things that normally happen all the time, things that do not normally happen. And of course, there's a lot of definitions about what those abnormal scenarios are. If someone is trying to force the system to do something that the system is not supposed to do, that's an abnormal scenario. If part or if a component of the system failed during the process, that's an abnormal scenario. If someone is trying to use a system and enter invalid data, that's an abnormal scenario. Okay. So keep in mind, those abnormal scenarios are supposed to be used for negative testing. That's why in my process, when I teach it in the classroom, I force people to think negative scenarios and the positive scenarios from the beginning. Because when you have a requirement or a user story that for which you build 60 or 70 scenarios, you look at how many negative and how many positive there. And that right away puts you in a good position that you are going to be doing enough negative testing, because as we all know, negative testing is something that we don't do very often, and some of us leave negative testing until the end. If we have time, we're going to do some more negative testing. So here's an example. Here's a requirement: customers shall be able to place orders online and pay by credit card. So these are all reasonable, common, normal scenarios. Okay. I wanted to put that example on the screen, although it seems to be trivial. It seems to be very, very simple, but I want you to remember that a scenario is not a set of steps. These are 4 different scenarios. Okay. The question is, who's supposed to write scenarios? I say, I don't care. Someone has to write them. I mean, you can have the requirement people who are writing requirements write the scenarios. You can have the developers write the scenarios. You can have system engineers. You can have the customer write scenarios. You can have the testing team write scenarios. You can have everyone write scenarios. Wow, that would be great, isn't it? Well, that's how I do it, by the way. In my projects, anyone can write scenarios. In my Agile projects, I'm a product owner. If I look at my user story and I look at the scenarios that the test team wrote, I can go and add a scenario anytime. If I feel the test team who wrote the scenarios overlooked something, I write it down. I write there in the tool, in the Ramana tool. I'll show it to you in a little bit. And of course, if it is obvious, if the scenario or 2 or 3 that I added are obvious, there is no question asked. Testers are not going to ask me and say, really? You want to add that? Well, it's just to say, oh, we overlooked that. Developers can write scenarios. They don't even have to get a permission from testers. Testers do not need to get a permission from developers to add more scenarios. Anyone can add scenarios as long as those scenarios are added in a common area where everyone can look at it anytime. Also, as long as when someone adds a scenario, everyone else gets notified about that. As you can see, I'm describing an Agile project. I'm describing a real collaboration process here. I've seen a lot of Agile projects do not do that much collaboration. Although I do that kind of collaboration even in a non-Agile project. There is no reason not to. There is no reason not to adopt that very strong form of collaboration, but collaboration needs tool to do that. Okay, anyone can add a scenario. As we already said, you can define scenarios either by informal brainstorming of requirements, or you can use models or use cases or decision table or any one of those things. And these are the formal models that were on the diagram on the left-hand side of the diagram. Okay. Let me just spend a few more minutes on the scenario validation process. And then, because I can see that I have about roughly 20 minutes left, I want to have at least 10-15 minutes to show you how this is all done in Ramana ALM. Ramana ALM is a complete requirement application lifecycle management tool. So I'll show you how it does that. And I don't care if you get Ramana or not. all what I care about really is for you to find a way to adopt those practices. Of course, if you think those practices are not useful, don't adopt them, but please share that with me. I'm hoping that through the questions panel, I don't like this, through the questions panel, you share with me whether you agree or disagree, and there will be some evaluation form that you will receive, I believe, today at the end of the webinar. When you receive that evaluation form, write some comments. Tell us if you believe this is good, or this is bad, or you've been following something similar to this, or whatever. All right. So the purpose of the scenario validation process is to refine scenarios, to validate scenarios, and reach consensus between the members of the project team. Again, who's supposed to be involved? Everyone. You can see here I included the user acceptance team. In fact, some of the most successful projects I've seen is those ones that bring the user acceptance people up front to be part of the scenario development / validation process. Even, I mean, some people say, well, no, we're not going to ask our UAT team to write scenarios. I don't know why. I don't know why we shouldn't ask our customers to write scenarios. But at the very least, if they have not been, if real users have not been part of writing the scenarios, if user acceptance team has not been part of writing the scenarios, at the very least, we need to involve them in the scenario validation process. Let me tell you that it's nonsense, totally nonsense to move on to development and testing without getting the UAT team and some of the real users involved, because those are the real people who understand how it's supposed to work. Now, of course, some people say, well, in an agile project, the product owner is supposed to know. Well, hopefully so, but not all the time. And the product owner may know high level of the functionality or high level of the user story, but he or she may not know really all the scenarios that can happen in production that the system needs to support. All right. What are we looking for when we validate scenarios? Very simple. Are we missing any other scenarios? Have we written enough positive and negative scenarios, or normal, abnormal? And the way you do this is because I tell people all the time, look at the positive scenarios versus negative scenarios. Make sure you at least have 50-50. You know, maybe 45-55. But if you have 20 negative scenarios and 40 positive scenarios, I can tell you right away that this is not good. Because I prove to people all the time that for every positive scenario, you should have at least 1 to 5, at least 5 possible negative scenarios. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the number of your negative scenarios must be at least 5 times the number of positive scenarios, but I'm going to say at least 50-50. But then when you follow my methodology to build your test cases, interestingly enough, there is another spot, there is another place within the methodology that help you write more and more negative tests. So at the end, you would have possibly easily, at least for every positive test case, you have about 5 negative test cases. And this methodology I'm talking about, I teach it completely in the course on best practices in software test planning and design as part of the courses offered by the International Institute for Software Testing. All right, here are the types of negative scenarios: shall not do, and that's what I said when I said you're trying to get the system to do things it's not supposed to do. You provide invalid data, or you exercise some extreme or abnormal condition, like data was corrupted, disconnected from the internet, there's failure in one of the system components, whatever. Okay. Now, part of the scenario validation process is to agree on what I call the expected behavior of each scenario. This is very critical. If I come up with a scenario like saying, customer, I think that was one of the scenarios here in the example I gave you. Here, 30 scenario. Placing order for multiple items, some in inventory and some are not. Well, it's great that I have this scenario, but if the developer and tester and the customer and the product owner and everyone else, if they don't agree on how the system is going to handle that, then we're left out with a lot of ambiguity, because everyone can make an assumption. I mean, I, as a developer writing the code, I say, well, in this case, if some of the items are not in inventory, I think we'll need to tell the customer that, and we'll say, sorry, we are not able to place the order. And when the tester comes to test my code, he or she might say, well, no, I expected to be able to get those items that are available in inventory, and I get some message about the ones that are not available. And when the customer looks at the behavior after it has been tested, he might say something totally different. So that's why expected behavior is part of scenarios. Okay. Now, someone says, are we really talking about the expected results of a test case? Remember, we are not talking test cases yet. Yes, it is true that later on, those expected behavior of scenarios are going to become or are going to feed into the expected results of the test cases. But that's simply saying when we build the scenarios and we write the expected behavior of scenarios, we are actually thinking test cases on a higher level. Okay, just reading some of the questions here. Well, Tracy says, we always do that when applicable. And I appreciate that, Tracy. I'm just curious to ask, when it is not applicable? I don't know if that's too much for you or that's too much to ask, but I have not seen a situation where this is not applicable. I don't know how. This is applicable to anything. Of course, the level of formality can vary. So if you can characterize for me one situation where you could not use that, would be great. I have a question about the presentation slides. Are they available? All the webinars by the International Institute for Software Testing are being recorded. And I was supposed to tell you this up front, right? Are being recorded and will become available at the IIST website within a week. So, but no, we don't send out copies or hard copies or soft copies of the presentations, because the presentations themselves mean nothing without my voice, right? Just kidding. No, I mean, if you start having those presentations around and give them to people, people are not going to make much sense of the actual slides unless you listen to the presentation. So we put those presentations on YouTube, all of them. If you actually go to the YouTube channel of IIST, you'll see, just search on IIST, you'll find all the previous webinars there. And actually, I'm gonna take you to this slide here, and yeah, if you go to YouTube here, so let me go very quick here. Come on. So this is the website for IIST. So if you go to the YouTube, actually you don't even have to go there. You can go to the free webinar. Free recorded webinars are right here, and all the previous webinars are listed. Okay, but actually when you click on any one of them to listen to, they are on YouTube. So that is a YouTube channel. So just to give us a week, this is the last webinar that was done last week, by the way. Okay, so back to my presentation. So everything that I talked about so far is actually implemented in Ramana ALM. Ramana ALM is an application lifecycle management tool. It is available for free if you want to use it for free for up to 5 users. We're not talking about just to download and play with it. No, we're saying use it for a real project. There is no limitation on the size of the project. There is no limitation on how many requirements or how many test cases or how much of project management you want to do there or anything, or how many bug reports. There is no limitation whatsoever. The only limitation is that it's got to be a small team of 5 people. If you need more than 5, then you need to purchase the more licenses. That's all what we're saying. So if you go to romanasoftware.com, here is a website. Remember, Ramana is a double M. romanasoftware.com. You'll see a link to get access. Now, interesting enough, you don't even have to download anything. We simplified it enough. When you request access to Ramana in the cloud, you get access to Ramana on our own servers. You just have to be willing to put your requirements and your bug reports or whatever on our servers. But it is very secure. Excuse me. When you get a log to your area, to your cloud, no one else can get access to that. No one else. I mean, there's no way for other people to see because it becomes your own cloud. You put your own requirements. You're the only person who can see that. Okay. Now, Ramana has been named as the best ALM tool, the best requirement management tool, and the best cloud solution by a company called RQX Global. That's a research company. And as you can see here, Ramana is right here at the top, got the highest score of 7.1. And you can see all the other tools from other large companies like IBM and HP. Quality Center is right here. And some of you already know that Quality Center is claimed to be an ALM tool. Well, actually, so this company, RQX Global, did not think that. Okay, Doors from IBM is the oldest requirement management tool we know about. Doors has been around for over 20 years now, maybe even more. And as you can see down here, it's got score of 1. Excuse me. Here is the other tool from IBM, Requisite Pro. Again, down here, and so on. I'm not going to go through the tools, but that's what Ramana ALM is. So please, if you're interested, go to the website, get access to Ramana ALM. Try it with one of your teams. It was a small project. Build a project. Try it. Before I leave, so let me go here and show you very quick how Ramana does that. Let me close this. I just opened the project before I start the presentation so that I don't take the time during the presentation to do this. When you open a project in Ramana, this is as you can see, this is Ramana 10.3. This is the name of the project, believe it or not. That's meaning that this data you're seeing is actually data from the project that was called Ramana 10.3. That's the release. So you can imagine we're using Ramana ALM to manage the Ramana projects. If I go here to the Ramana, what we call the portfolio screen, it shows all the versions. In fact, the last version we're working on now as we speak, let me find that down the scroll. It's not helping me very good. The dark boxes, by the way, the dark boxes on the top are system names, and the lighter boxes at the bottom are projects. So here, this is Ramana ALM, and now this is for 15.3 is the last release we're working on. Okay, 15.3. But keep in mind, please, this is a snapshot of the data at any given point of time, which means when I'm opening this project, which is 10.3, this is not like if I click on requirements here, those are not all the requirements that were implemented in 10.3. There is much more than that. But it is true, this is a snapshot. So in 10.3, some of the requirements we actually implemented are configuring attribute values, configure issue report values, attribute values, and so on. So configuring attribute values was a big feature in 10.3. All right. If I click on any one of those requirements, I can see the details of the requirement on the right as it is populating here. So let me do this. What am I doing wrong? Come on. Maybe I clicked too many times, so the server is getting busy. I played with this project actually before we started, so yeah, it is working here. I think I clicked too many times, so multiple requests went to the server. I don't like that, so let me. No, that's not how much time it takes to populate a requirement. So so let me log out the project. Let me go back to the project and open it. You know, something strange happened here. Oh, I'm sorry. I scrolled it down all the way, so I'm not seeing the project. I'm looking at the product here. So here is the here is the project. Okay, because I was scrolled it down all the way. So let me now click on requirements. Okay, functional requirements. And let's click on the same requirement that was taking time here to find out why it was taking time. Now it is pulling the data from the server. And of course, you can imagine when you pull out a requirement, it pulls the data from several tables. So because as you can see, as you're going to see in a little bit, the screen is a bit complex. It has the scenarios, it has the use cases, it has the test cases, everything on one screen. So that's why it takes a time, the first time. As you can see at the top here, this requirement has been baselined or implemented. So I would not be able to make any changes to it, right? But because the project is done long time ago, but I just wanted to show you the concept of scenarios. So this is the requirement. This is the requirement definition right here. And by the way, if you configured Ramana ALM to use it in an Agile project, the user story would be at the top here. Your verification or implementation criteria would be down here. I was obviously testing here to see if I can add anything. And then down here are the different other entities that are connected to the requirement or the user story. So if I were to click here, for example, to scenarios, it gives me the list of the scenarios that have been defined for this requirement. Okay, and here they are. I got the scenario name, I got scenario description. In Ramana also we do risk management of scenarios because not all scenarios are equally important. So we do the risk analysis through the frequency of occurrence, the impact of failure, and the probability of failure. I can explain this some other time, but so we calculate here a testing priority, and if I were to sort on the testing priority, it'll put the lowest priority at the top. I can sort reverse it. So it tells me that here is a testing priority, which is normally a number between 1 and 3. So the lowest priority, the lowest testing priority of any one of my scenarios is 2.3 out of 3. If you got some 1.1 or whatever, then okay, no, I'm sorry, I got 2 pages here. So here is if I want to look at the second page, no, I was wrong. I got some scenarios that are 1.67 and 2 and so on. So here how you can decide on how you can decide on what scenarios to test to what not, because not all scenarios are going to be tested. If you click on the scenario number on any one of the scenario, it'll certainly open the scenario screen and it'll show you the details of that scenario just to tell you what kind of information. Now, I told you a scenario is nothing more than one phrase that describes a situation or or a condition that could possibly happen in production that the system needs to handle. Again, the scenario screen is pulling data from different tables, so it takes a little bit of time to populate here. So, but here is all what you have to write for a scenario. Okay, now all these things are optional. So scenario description is optional. Expected behavior is there, but it's optional. Okay, so in the first brainstorming level, then you only come up with this. And if you want, you can specify the frequency of occurrence, the impact of failure, the probability, or not. Here it tells you that this scenario is linked to this requirement. At the top here also you can see it. Thank you so much for your time. I don't want to take much of your time. I want to close this presentation with, again, a reminder of what the International Institute for Software Testing does. Please feel free to go to the YouTube channel of IIST to find out things that IST does. Don't forget the conference in San Diego, and I hope to see you in future webinars by IIST and Ramana Software. I will peek into the questions very quick to see if there's any question that I need to answer. There's a question that says, does ALM tie into support system like BMC, Remedy? The quick answer, Tracy, is no, because I do not, I mean, Ramana ALM links to many other things, such as bug tracking tools, but the answer to BMC Remedy, no. Okay, so I'm assuming BMC Remedy is a bug tracking tool. It does link to Bugzilla, it links to Jira, but we have not done integration with BMC yet. And the reason is Ramana ALM itself has so, you say it's a supported tool. It has, okay, so please explain to me further. I mean, it's my own ignorance about what Remedy does. Supported tool meaning technical support, like help desk. Tickets, okay, so same like Jira, I'm assuming. But Ramana has its own support section, because if you look here at Ramana, we have the issue management here, which is the same as supported tickets, but you can also integrate with Jira. But we integrated with Jira and Bugzilla only because few customers said we're still using them. And certainly if we get a customer who's using Remedy and would like us to integrate with it, we're talking here less than a week of work to do it. No, it is not, but it could easily be done. It's just the popularity of the tools. We all know that Bugzilla and Jira, many people are using them. That's why we integrated with them. We certainly can look into integration with Remedy. Thank you for the heads up. I will look into that, being the architect of the tool, and I will recommend this to the development team. Again, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for your participation. And we'll hope to see you in other webinars.